important, and why am I so fascinated with it? Well, let's start with some history. It's believed that the island chain of Chagos was well known about and explored by the neighboring Maldivian people for hundreds of years. The people of the Maldives inhabit a similar archipelago nation and have Indo-Aryan origins with significant Dravidian input. Even though the island was well known about and infrequently visited by Maldivian fishermen, people refused to settle there because of its remoteness, being hundreds of miles away from the main Maldivian island chain. Fast forward a few hundred years and you have famous Portuguese explorer Pedro de Mascarenhas, who the Mascarene island chain is named after, is credited with discovering the island in the mid-16th century. The island, however, was abandoned by the Portuguese, who saw no real tangible use for this lonely and isolated place. In the early 1700s, the island was surveyed and claimed by the French as a dependency of their neighboring colony of Mauritius. Because of Chagos' extreme isolation and relatively small size, being only 23 square miles, or about the same size as Manhattan in New York City, the French saw no real purpose for it other than farming and plantations. So only a few decades later, the few handful of French families that lived on the island imported a few dozen African slaves to help them on the plantations. Naturally, many of the African slaves had children with their French masters, as was extremely common in those days, as well as some Indian laborers that were brought onto the island, created a new hybrid ethnicity known as the Chagosians or the Iloi. The Chagosians spoke a Creole language closely related to the language of the neighboring islands of Mauritius and Reunion, and after a relatively short period of occupation, the French emancipated all of their slaves throughout their empire in 1840, and most of the remaining French families on the island left to go back to France, seeing no real purpose there. However, their former slaves remained in the area, seeing the Chagos archipelago as their homeland. However, during the same time period, the island chain was actually claimed by Great Britain, who wanted to administer it as part of Mauritius, an island which they had just taken from the French. The British generally left the island alone with no real plans for colonization or settlement. They actually let their self-governing colony of Mauritius administer the Chagos archipelago, along with the couple surrounding islands of Rodrigues and Agalaga. In the meantime, the island's Creole population grew to around 5,000 people by the 1960s. But that actually changed in 1965 when the British government decided that they wanted the islands back, and they bought them from Mauritius for £3 million. Only a year later, in 1966, the British and American governments had come to an agreement where the American military would be able to use the main island of the Chagos archipelago, Diego Garcia, as one big military base.